In this video, I will help you navigate the GPSR and also explain some of the key articles. Now, before you begin, make sure you always select the latest consolidated version. At the time of recording, we only have the legal act, at least when it comes to the English language version of the GPSR. But the GPSR will likely be amended in the future, so make sure you always pick the latest consolidated version. Okay, so I'm going to skip this and go down to Article 1. And it is in Article 1. We can read the purpose of the regulation. Essentially, the GPSR sets essential safety requirements for consumer products sold in the EU. This is sort of a safety net regulation. It applies to products and aspects not covered by other product-specific regulations and directives in the EU. Sort of everything else. You can see it that way. Now, in Article 2, you can find a list of products and categories that the regulation does not apply to. Scroll down to Article 3, find definitions. I will not go into detail and explain each of these. That would take too much time. But two that I really want to highlight, and that's the definition of a manufacturer and a definition of an importer. And this is important because you need to, well, actually step one, the first step is to determine if you are defined as a manufacturer or if you are defined as an importer. Now, the manufacturer has the primary responsibility to actively implement the requirements of the GPSR, to create documentation, to design the product according to certain safety requirements, to ensure that it's correctly labeled and so on. So this is where you have to begin. And a manufacturer could indeed be the company that manufactures the product, but it could also be a company that has a product designed or manufactured, meaning that you design a product and you then have it manufactured by someone else. You could still be defined as a manufacturer in that case and assume the responsibility of the manufacturer and manufactures that product under that person's name or trademark. So if I go and I contract the production of, say, a baby carrier to a factory in China, and I then sell this in the EU, but it's my brand, possibly my design, then I am the manufacturer. An importer, on the other hand, is a company in this context that's based in the EU, who is importing products from countries outside the EU. Okay? Now, it's interesting here that they specifically make it clear that an importer can only be based in the EU, whereas a manufacturer could, well, there's no geographic limitation here. A manufacturer could be based anywhere. And that's important. I will explain why that matters in a bit. Okay, so step one, you have to determine, are you a manufacturer, an importer, or maybe something else? Now let's go down to Article 6. Now Article 6 is essentially a list of aspects that matter when you assess if your product is safe. Okay, now this could indeed be the design, the technical features, composition, and so on, but you also have to take into consideration packaging, instructions for assembly, installation, use, warnings, age group labeling, and so on. So I'm not going to go into detail here. That's not the purpose of this video, but read Article 6. This will help you understand, or at least bring up the points that you have to think about when you work towards ensuring that your product is safe. Okay, and in practice, what can this mean? Well, it could mean that you have to make sure that the design is safe, that you implement certain safety standards, that you make sure that the packaging, especially if you sell children's products, doesn't have, say, small parts or something like that, that you provide sufficient instructions for assembly, and so on. So read Article 6 to understand the different areas that must be taken into consideration when you are ensuring safety and thus compliance with the GPSR. Article 7 and Article 8, two really important articles of the GPSR. And just mention safety standards. And what Article 7 essentially says is that if you, as a manufacturer, comply with harmonized standards that are harmonized under the GPSR, then you have also complied with the safety aspects of the GPSR. Now, why is this important? Because the GPSR does not provide product-specific safety requirements. Yes, it does say that a product must be safe. It doesn't tell me how I must design, say, a baby carrier, like the specific technical information that must be implemented and met to be able to claim or reach the level of safety that is required. Now, that's information that can only be found in product standards, harmonized standards in this specific case. So that's what Article 7 is saying, that in order to comply with GPSR, you have to identify the safety standards that apply to your product. And step 1 would be to look for harmonized standards published in the official journal of the European Union. We have a tutorial dedicated to that. And in the case when you don't have harmonized standards for your product, which is very common because there are about 100 to 150, meaning that you don't have harmonized standards for every single product, well, then you have to consider other options, national requirements, for example. Now in Article 8, it gives us an expanded list of options in the scenario when the options in Article 7 have been exhausted, meaning that perhaps you don't have a harmonized standard or you don't have any of the other options described. Well, that doesn't mean that you can, let's say, just skip this and not ensure compliance with standards. It just means that you have to look at other options like European standards that are not harmonized, for example. Just to give you an idea, there's a harmonized standard for baby carriers under the GPSR, but for some reason not for strollers. Why is that? I have no idea. But if you sell a baby carrier, well, then we have a harmonized standard as described up here. If we sell baby strollers, well, then we have to look at other European standards. For some reason, that one has not been published in the official journal of the EU, if I recall correctly. That's just one example. We can look at international standards and agreements, voluntary certification schemes, national standards, product safety codes, and so on. So essentially what this is saying is that it's sort of a hierarchy. Is that, okay, you have this product. The first thing you should consider is harmonized standards. Can you find a harmonized standard for your product? If not, what other options do you have as explained under point 1b? Okay, that didn't work out, then you look at this list. Okay, so you go through these one by one until you have found something. Okay, now let's go to Article 9. So in Article 9, you find obligations of manufacturers. And in Article 9, you essentially find the list of tasks that must be completed by you as a manufacturer, assuming you are defined as a manufacturer. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but in short, what it says is that you have to make sure that your product is technically safe, that it's designed to comply with the requirements of the regulation. You have to prepare technical documentation. That's described in point 2. You have to maintain the technical documentation for 10 years. Point 5 and 6 concerns labeling requirements for the product and the company or the manufacturer. Provide instructions. Yeah. And then it's point 8, 9, 10, and so on. Okay. But Article 9, obligations of manufacturers, describe the steps that must be completed by the manufacturer. That's the core, the engine room of the regulation, you can put it that way. In Article 11, you find obligations of importers. And in short, if the manufacturer is responsible for actively implementing compliance, meaning designing for compliance, identifying standards, creating label files, creating documentation, making sure your product is tested, well, then the importer is the other side of the same coin, and the importer basically has to request documentation and information from the manufacturer and verify that everything has been done correctly, and that is described in Article 11, obligations of importers. Two sides of the same coin. Okay, let's scroll down here to Article 16, and this concerns responsible person for products placed on the union market. And in short, what Article 16 is about essentially says that a product covered by the GPSR can only be sold if there is an economic operator established in the EU who is, let's say, responsible for certain tasks. And these tasks are explained in Article 4.3 of the Market Surveillance Regulation. But in short, what it says here is that there must be someone in the EU, at least a contact point, and that could indeed be a manufacturer. If you're an EU company and you're manufacturing, you're defined as a manufacturer, then you are the economic operator. If you're an EU importer and you import goods from the UK or from China and you sell it in the EU, well, you are likely the economic operator. But what if you're based in, well, if you are a manufacturer in China or in the UK and you're selling to consumers in the EU, so there's no importer, there's no company established in the EU, well, in that case, you still need an economic operator, and this is why you need an authorized representative. More information about that part, EU ARs, can be found in a dedicated tutorial. And here you can also find labeling requirements. And this explains why, in addition to the manufacturer information, you also need the EU AR information if this applies to you. And then we have the last article that I will cover in this introduction video to the GPSR, and that's Article 19, Obligations of Economic Operators in the case of distance sales, or in other words, responsibilities if you're selling things online through a website, right? A Shopify website or something else. So what it says here is that you need to make sure that certain information is available on the website. That's information about the manufacturer, postal address, electronic address. And this could be one single company. If you are selling, let's say, you're a specialized company, you sell your own branded products, you're defined as a manufacturer, that could be a simple affair. But it could be more complicated if you're reselling products from other manufacturers. And key point here is that you also need to provide warning and safety information that provided on labeling and documentation, like a user instruction. Well, that also has to be available online in addition. Okay, it doesn't replace the need to provide a printed version, but it must also be provided online. Okay, so that's everything I had in this version of the GPSR video.